hard.
All right, well, why don't we get started? Welcome everybody to the third of four webinars that we're hosting to discuss the results of the National Trauma Research Action Plan study. I'm pleased to have Dr. Nicole Gibran with us today. Dr. Gibran is a leading international expert on burn care and management, and has had a long and productive career caring for complex burn patients, and was the leader of our burn and reconstructive panel for the NTRAP. So welcome, Nicole. What I'd like to do up front is just give a brief overview of the project, a little bit of background for those who may not be familiar with the project. This is a project that was funded by the U.S. Army through a competitive grant process. Of course, the views and opinions that we're going to discuss are those of the authors and should not be construed as anything officially representing the Department of the Army or the U.S. government. Next slide. So our agenda for today, again, I'm going to give a brief overview of the Coalition for National Trauma Research, which is the group that is running this project, as well as the overall project itself. We previously have had the results of these panels, the pediatric, geriatric, and long-term outcomes presented. Today we'll be presenting the burn results. At the end, we'll have some wrap-up material that will make you aware of all the resources that are available on our website and where you can access the publications of this work, as well as some strategies that we've developed for secondary analysis that may be of interest to you as a researcher, and how to access that data. Next slide. So the Coalition for National Trauma Research is truly a coalition of multiple organizations that are committed to enhancing trauma research across the U.S. We have sort of a three-pronged strategy for that. One is to advocate for sustainable research funding that's commensurate with the burden of disease. The second is to coordinate research efforts across our professional organizations. And you can see all of the organizations that are engaged in this work. And then to enhance the infrastructure for at the national level for multi-center investigation. We have, sorry, can you just leave it there for just 1 second? We have a number of core members representing some of the larger trauma organizations and the American College of Surgeons. And of course, for this, relevant to this presentation, the American Burn Association is a key and core member of our coalition. And then you can see here a whole host of stakeholder and affiliate members as well. Next slide, please. This work derives directly from the 2016 NASM report, which was really a call to action for the trauma community, focusing on our strengths and weaknesses in trauma care across the country, and really calling for a strategy to eliminate preventable death and disability. Recommendation number 7 in that particular national report was to strengthen trauma research, and specifically called for developing a national trauma research action plan. And so based on that recommendation, the grant was submitted to the DoD, which was subsequently funded, which has led to this work. Next slide, please. So the original grant had 3 aims. We're talking primarily today about work from AIM 1. AIM 1 was designed to perform a gap analysis of both military and civilian trauma research to identify where there was a need for additional research, and also to help prioritize those needs across the continuum of care. We had 2 additional aims, which are also have published their results. One that spent a fair bit of time working through and defining optimal metrics for long-term functional outcome in injured patients, and a third aim that has looked at regulatory barriers and best practices for investigators interested in this space. Next slide, please. AIM 1 had 11 Delphi panel focus areas. And again, we're going to hear from burn and reconstructive surgery today, but you can see all of the different panels, and each of these panels is presenting in this webinar series over time and has published their results. Next slide. Prior to initiating this process, we designed to be maximally inclusive, and so reached out to all of these professional organizations who provided representatives to the appropriate panels for their interests. Again, trying to ensure that this work was multidisciplinary. Next slide, please. The approach we took for this work was a Delphi approach. This is a tried and true consensus-based technique that allows you to work in groups, but with anonymity for discussion, and provides controlled feedback over sequential rounds. And this is a strategy that is used frequently for things like developing research agendas. Now, this is the overall workflow. So we had an initial round where the panel members were asked to solicit a list of research questions, things that they felt were unanswered questions in the literature and important. Between those rounds, a literature review was conducted to provide feedback to the panel on what was currently available. And then in subsequent rounds, those research questions were prioritized through a series of voting online, where feedback could be provided as to why someone thought this was a high priority or not a high priority question. And ultimately, once a consensus threshold was reached, then the study was completed. So we used a Likert scale from 1 to 9 to rate the priority of the questions, and scores with a mean score, questions with a mean score of 1 to 3 were considered low priority, 4 to 6 medium priority, and 7 to 9 high priority. And you'll see some of that data in just a little bit. And just to give you a sense of how this worked, so if panel members voted on a question, you could see the top question there was pretty widespread of priority ratings. Then they would go on to the next round where they could see the comments made by previous reviewers and could either change their vote or keep it the same to ultimately reach a consensus threshold of 60%. Next slide. This is a list of the current publications. These are all in the Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery, and the journal has created a collection for these on its homepage. So if you go to the top of their website and you click on collections, you will see the NTRAP manuscripts all in one place, so you can easily access them and reference them. Next slide. All right, I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Gibran, who's going to walk you through some of the key findings from the Burn and Reconstructive Surgery panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Eileen. So this slide summarizes the results, and it was presented as a quick one look for the Journal of Trauma when we published the original paper, which actually was the first Delphi panel to be published. And using the methodology that Dr. Bulger already described, we came up with an original 949 research questions related to burns. And of those, 597 reached consensus. Of the 597, just under 60% were deemed high priority, 180 or 30% were medium, and just over 10% were deemed low priority research topics. I have to say, the amount of information and the ability to sort through 949 questions, or even 597 questions, was daunting. And I felt that we really would benefit from an easier way of looking at bioinformatically the data and using data visualization tools to sort through the results that we had and try to get heads or tails about what priorities our consensus panelists felt were top high priority. And so we'll show some of these results, but I thought that the interesting conclusion from our panel was that there was a huge emphasis on the need to understand functional recovery, both physical and psychological, and a lot of relate a lot related to scar management and long-term outcome management, as opposed to what one might think of as traditional topics of research interest, resuscitation, acute inhalation injury management, and the like. So I thought that that was a very interesting take-home message from this panel. Next slide, please. Here were the panelists that were that participated, and you can see that a majority of them were burn surgeons. Some of them also were intensivists. Some of them were also trauma surgeons. So those were not mutually exclusive, obviously. And just over 10% of them were reconstructive surgeons. Most of the reconstructive surgeons were burn reconstructive surgeons, but we also covered non-burn reconstructive trauma surgery in this panel. And some of these were non-burn surgeons as well. And you can see their area of expertise, and this was self-defined. And most of them were hospital-based, and they had a wide range of interest, but 40% of them identified as being interested in long-term care and rehabilitation. Next slide, please. Here are the top 5 burn questions that were both high priority and reached consensus. You can see the top one is actually related to plastic surgery. This is a hot topic in the United States right now. Does laser treatment of burns improve or mitigate hypertrophic scarring? One theme I think that was very interesting and certainly reflects the greater medical field with the emphasis on PCORI priorities is the interest in involving burn survivors and their families. And you can see that the second and fifth most, the highest priority questions actually reflected what was important to burn survivors. And I think that's another theme that demonstrates the current trend in research. And you can also see that questions 3 and 4, not related to resuscitation or inhalation injury, but again, related to hypertrophic scarring, both at the clinical level and at the translational or basic science level. Next slide, please. So what stood out for me? I think that I was very impressed that outcomes research ranked very high among the top 10 taxonomy terms. I should say that in the middle of analyzing the burn data, we realized that we would benefit from having a very strong taxonomy infrastructure that could be applied to questions from all 11 panels. And the strength of this is that it allows us to actually cross-reference different panels. So if there were questions that were tagged with a geriatrics or a pediatric taxonomy term, we could look at all the different panels and see what the interest across all 11 panels related to pediatrics or geriatrics. The same was true with the type of research. So we could do the same type of analysis across the 11 panels, looking at outcomes research or QI research or basic science research. And so that was something that caused the burn panel to pause a little bit while we got this taxonomy infrastructure right. And the tables can be found in many of the publications. So there is a reference to the different taxonomy terms. But getting back to the takeaways from our panel, outcomes research ranked very high in terms of the type of research that our panelists were interested in. And again, I thought this reflected their growing interest in functional recovery rather than survival as an optimal metric. I already said it, I can't say it enough. There was a strong emphasis on hypertrophic scar pathophysiology, and of the 25 top research questions, 9 of them related to hypertrophic scarring. Only one of the top 25 high priority questions, again, related to fluid or blood product resuscitation. And of the lowest priority questions, 7 of the 25 related to resuscitation. So again, I think our emphasis has shifted to more long-term outcome priorities. I thought that the number of questions that were tagged as interventional clinical trials and comparative effectiveness, again, was an important insight into, I think, the community's desire to have more randomized controlled trials that are related to interventions, especially pharmaceutical interventions. Next slide, please. Looking at the data, I would say, again, the biggest gaps are related to basic science and the need to better define the immune responses and metabolic responses. This actually, I think, is interesting because of so much of the multi-center, multidisciplinary efforts related to the GLUE grant from 2001 to 2011, which really focused on exactly that. But it suggests that there still is opportunity to better define the immune and metabolic responses to not just burns, but all injury. The basic science interest in terms of fibroproliferative processes as well stood out in the research priorities that the panelists felt were high priority. I alluded to the fact that randomized clinical trials were emphasized, and again, pharmaceutical intervention was one of the taxonomy terms that bubbled to the top. And importantly, I think it's good to know that our panelists viewed quality improvement as a research modality that needed to be emphasized. Next slide, please. So what are the most important questions to answer? I think that that is something that the research community is going to need to suss out. And I think that the paper that was published and the supplemental data that was put out with that paper provide an opportunity for researchers, especially young researchers, to begin to look and say, what did subject matter experts see as being crucial? I've already enumerated some of the topics that were prioritized: fibroproliferation, both translational, basic science, and clinical research related to scarring, and involving the burn survivors in functional outcomes research. I think that these are the questions that we need to consider. And I think one take-home message that I had was that even when we are doing acute studies on inhalation injury or wound management, a lot of the questions were phrased in a way that suggested people wanted to know what the long-term outcomes were after an acute intervention. And so many of the questions said, what are the results 6, 12, and 24 months after wound care in the field, or events that happen late after injury resulting from different acute care interventions? And I think that is one of the take-home messages from this panel. Next slide. So again, some of the ideas for secondary analyses, I think that there are opportunities to harmonize the data across the 11 Delphi panels. And again, the taxonomy infrastructure tool that was created as part of NTRAP should facilitate this. I think there are opportunities to look at acute lung injury, whether it's in burn patients or in other trauma patients, is an opportunity. I think functional recovery and health-related quality of life is an opportunity that can be looked at across all of the panels. Age-related responses. And any of these, I think, could be looked at specifically within the burn data, but again, trying to bridge the gap between all of the panels is something that should be attempted. I'll give you one example. I'm working with Juan Escobar and Jimmy Fong, who was our bioinformatics subject matter expert on many of these papers. So the three of us are working to do a secondary analysis of the burn data specifically related to rehabilitation and long-term outcomes, to see whether or not we can dig a little deeper and figure out what is the most pressing issues other than perhaps hypertrophic scar research. And so next slide, I think we're going to shift gears. So I said that we were also looking at non-burn reconstructive issues, since we know that our plastic surgeons often are responsible for putting back pieces that are injured during the course of resuscitating a seriously injured patient. And we included non-burn reconstructive surgeons here, but I will say that most of the reconstructive questions, again, in this panel related to burns, but there were several sections with maybe 10 questions related to craniofacial, a lot of questions related to management of composite tissue allografts, which seem to be a common theme. So if you look at these top 5 reconstructive questions, a lot of interest in nerves and how to manage the nerves in amputations or in tissue regeneration or replants and whatnot. This, I thought, showed that some of the work that Susan McKinnon has been doing in St. Louis is still very apropos. And so 2 of these top 5 questions relate to management of nerves. And you'll see that 3 of the top 5 questions relate to composite tissue allografts, whether they're related to the physical aspects or the psychological aspects. And I thought that this was specifically very interesting. Other questions that bubbled to the top but didn't make it to the top 5 included specific questions about how to manage patients with craniofacial fractures, and including questions related to intracranial pressure. And so again, there are opportunities to perhaps cross over to, let's move this next slide, please. Cross over to look at the neurotrauma panel to see whether there's any common interest there. So what stood out, I've already mentioned the craniofacial trauma with, it says intraocular pressure monitoring, excuse me, that's intracranial pressure monitoring. A preponderance of questions related to CTA, and then management of nerves with extremity surgery and replants. Next slide. I thought that since most of the reconstructive surgery panelists were actually also burn surgeons, I'd be remiss in not saying that hypertrophic scar reconstructive management and prevention, which is part of reconstruction, was a major theme among the reconstructive questions. A lot of questions related to the role of stem cells, both from a translational standpoint and use as a regenerative tool for improving results. And then another topic which seems like a one-off, but it certainly is important with extremity surgery and also in burns, is heterotopic ossification management. And that was both at a clinical standpoint, from a clinical standpoint, and also a translational and a bench research standpoint. And again, I think that the data would suggest that the most important questions to answer related to reconstructive surgery has to do with the two themes right now that we're seeing with how to manage nerves. And this could have something to do with some of the work that's being done with prosthetics that are actually innervated, and also the role of composite tissue allografts in our compendium of tools for either hand transplants or face transplants. Next slide. Again, there were a small number of non-burn reconstructive questions, but I think that they could be queried more thoroughly and combined with some of the questions in both neurotrauma and the orthopedic panels to identify common themes. Next slide. Back to Eileen. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, for that great summary and for organizing and leading that panel. It was a tremendous amount of work. And as you said, the first panel to finish and the first one for us to work through the data analysis on. So really guided all the additional work. I'm going to provide some wrap-up comments here as to where you can locate a lot of this material. So we have a NTRAP webpage that's within the Coalition for National Trauma Research website. So if you go to the center website and you click on research, you'll get to our page. And this allows you to again get a lot of the background material and links to a lot of the resources that have been developed as part of this project. Next slide. Here's a list of what you'll find there, a brief overview of the project, an executive summary, webinars, link, sign-ups for future webinars, and will be one more webinar in July, which will wrap up this set of panels. And then links to all the published manuscripts, who are members of the Delphi panels. And importantly, as Nicole alluded to, you'll get the data dictionary for this tagging taxonomy. So all of the questions across all the panels were laboriously tagged with common terminology, which allows this searching across panels. And it really does set up a great platform for secondary data analysis. And then there's a data request form. If you're interested in doing a secondary analysis, you can submit that to us We will make sure that it's not duplicative of some other project that's already ongoing. Might combine people if they have similar projects, but we can work to get that data out to you. So this is just a sample of the taxonomy. So you can see the different categories. Again, I think the questions are coded based on patient population, the phase of care in which the inquiry occurs, some basic mechanism, some specific injuries, some interventions, clinical outcomes, patient-reported outcomes, and then the type of research. So an example of a secondary paper that was just accepted for publication is looking at the issue of venous thromboembolism across all the panels, and that's a good example of a way to really look at a question that you're particularly interested in and understand the breadth of that across the NTRAP. This is what the data access form looks like. Again, you can easily fill it out online. It'll be reviewed, and we'll get back to you with how to get the data. And there is some data use issues. So the data are embargoed for 1 year from the time of publication of the panel, unless someone you're working with served on the panel. And there's lots of people that served on these panels, so pretty easy to link you up with someone if you're in that 1 year period. Some of these are already coming out of the 1 year period, so that will be less of an issue. Panel leaders and panelists can use the data prior to the embargo date. Requests are considered within a month, and there's a data use agreement that we'll ask you to sign, and we have a publications policy that we'll review with you. And that's it. So if there are any questions, if not, we'll wrap this up. I know that a lot of people couldn't make it today, but we're going to send this out, the recording out to everybody that signed up, and it'll be available on our website as well. Any additional comments or questions? All right, well, thank you very much. And we'll look forward to seeing you in July for the next panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Pam. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Nicole.